All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. James Bartek, and I'm the Programs Manager for the Kentucky Military History Museum at the Kentucky Historical Society. And I'd like to welcome you all again to the Kentucky Military History Museum Speaker Series, which focuses broadly on various aspects of military history, but with a particular emphasis on topics that relate to the Civil War, Kentucky history, Appalachian history, and Southern history. Many of the presentations will be virtual and will remain free to the public, while others will be a hybrid format held in person at the History Center in Frankfort, but also able to be viewed live via the KHS Facebook or YouTube channel. Tonight's presenter is Dr. Diane Mutti Burke. She teaches history at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She has focused much of her research on the history of Missouri. Her award-winning first book on slavery's border, Missouri's Small Slaveholding Households, 1815 to 1865, which was printed at the University of Georgia Press in 2010, is an examination of how slavery and slaveholding were influenced by both the geography and the smaller scale of slavery in the states. In addition, she has co-edited 3 collections of scholarly articles on Kansas City and the Missouri-Kansas border region. And Dr. Mutti Burke is currently completing an edited and annotated diary of a small slaveholding Cooper County, Missouri woman named Paulina Stratton, as well as working on a monograph about refugee populations in the border states during the Civil War, which is the basis of tonight's talk, the Civil War and the Civilian Refugee Crisis in the Border South. This presentation will be recorded and at some point will be available to view on our YouTube channel. The Q&A function has been enabled, so if you have questions, just type them in as we go and we'll try to address them as best we can after the presentation, which will last about 40 minutes, leaving us about 20 minutes or so for discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Diane.
All right, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to talk with you tonight. I am going to attempt to enable a screen share here. And is it working? Does it look right?
It is, yes.
Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so again, thanks for having me with you to talk about my research tonight. It is true that much of what I've done on this project so far is research on the border states, but I am very ambitiously attempting to look at refugee situation throughout the South during the American Civil War. So I'm expanding to other states beyond those that I know the best. So this may be a story that is unknown to you. And in fact, it's unknown to a lot of people in Missouri as well. On August 25th, 1863, Union General Thomas Ewing Jr., who was from Ohio, the new commander of the District of the Border in western Missouri and eastern Kansas, issued General Order Number 11. Ewing ordered the virtual depopulation of 4 western Missouri counties along the state's unobstructed border with Kansas. A brutal Confederate guerrilla raid on Lawrence, Kansas in late August 1863 led Ewing to conclude that the only way to quell the violence along the state line was to evict disloyal Missouri residents who he believed harbored the guerrillas. The order called for the complete removal of a large civilian population, only allowing those who could prove loyalty to the U.S. government to relocate within 1 mile of Union Army encampments. After Union soldiers swept in to enforce the order, little remained but charred remnants of the homes and farms that had dotted the countryside. The experience angered Confederate guerrilla and post-war bandit Cole Younger, who of course rode with the James brothers. He observed in the wake of Order Number 11 that the people of the border were, quote, scattered to the 4 winds of the earth. The forced exodus of civilians that followed Ewing's General Order Number 11 was one of the most dramatic, and I would argue egregious, actions by the military against the civilian population during the American Civil War. But though epic in scope, the Order Number 11 displacement is only a small piece of the story of refugees during the American Civil War, a story that is largely understudied. In the past decade, scholars have made tremendous strides in examining the experiences of the people living and working in the northern and southern home fronts. They have not focused as much on the stories of the many civilians who were displaced by troop movements, guerrilla warfare, political conflict, and wartime deprivations, however. The last region-wide study of Civil War refugees was published in 1964 by historian Mary Elizabeth Massey, but this book concentrates mostly on wealthy white enslavers. Recently, scholars such as Amy Merrill Taylor, Thavolia Glimp, Jim Downs, and Chandra Manning, among others, have dedicated considerable attention to the wartime experiences of newly freed people. The story of the many poor and middling white people who were also displaced by the war has received far less attention, however. There also has been little focus on the many indigenous Americans who were displaced by the conflict. A few people have published regionally focused studies of refugees. They pop up here and there throughout a lot of works on the Civil War, but none of these publications have explored the topic of refugees in the comprehensive manner I'm proposing for my project. So my project will focus on the experiences of refugees throughout the American South during the war. In the Upper South and border states, the situation was particularly acute in areas with high concentrations of troops, divided political loyalties, and guerrilla violence. Over time, as Union troops penetrated deeper into the heart of the Confederacy, an increasing number of people there left their homes as well. Civilians spilled over into communities in northern states and western territories as people sought refuge away from the fighting. So scattered to the four winds of the earth, the civilian refugee crisis in the American Civil War, which is the working title for my book, examines the experiences of diverse displaced civilian populations throughout the South and then called Indian Country, now Oklahoma, during the war. A comprehensive approach allows a fuller assessment of the scope of the humanitarian crisis, as well as provides opportunities to compare the experiences of various groups of refugees across geographic regions. My research explores all aspects of refugees' experiences. So the circumstances that forced them out of their homes, what happened to them during the war and who rendered them aid, and what decisions they made in the aftermath of the war. I examine the war's impact on the various categories of civilians who were displaced, but pay particular attention to the stories of everyday people who frequently are left out of the historical narrative. Many of those who displaced were white women, children, and elderly people in reduced economic circumstances. And while this was a major group who was displaced, wealthier white people, as well as indigenous people, were also forced from their homes. And although they fled in search of a better life, enslaved people faced many hardships and challenges as they made their way to freedom, and of course should be considered refugees as well. This past year, I began this research in earnest by traveling to archives in 7 former slave states, so Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. And I spent numerous weeks researching at the Filson and the Kentucky Historical Society. I also spent a couple of weeks conducting research in New York City at the New York Public Library. I was looking at the records of the U.S. Sanitary Commission to determine how much the organization interacted with aid to refugee populations during the war. Of course, that was not their charge. They were supposed to be focusing on the troops, but it turns out they did engage with refugees in various levels, at various levels in different parts of the South. And although it's been somewhat of a needle in a haystack search, I found some amazing things along the way. And some of these amazing things I found in Kentucky, which, much like Missouri, experienced a high volume of refugees due to the state's divided loyalties and its border location. But even though I was on the road for weeks this past year, I feel like I've just scratched the surface. I'll need to return to most of those states that I mentioned to do more research, and I haven't yet set foot in many other places. That said, with considerable archival research under my belt at this point, I believe that the refugee situation in the border states of Missouri and Kentucky was particularly acute. The hard consequences of war, including civilian displacement, reached the border states much earlier than in many other parts of the South. In these states, armed enemy forces repeatedly targeted civilians, costing them their property and occasionally their lives. Union troops attempted to subdue disloyal civilian populations. Both Black and white residents faced the consequences of emancipation, and many people were displaced from their homes. In many ways, what the Civil War eventually became, a hard war that engaged civilians at a high level, began on these contested border regions. In Missouri, the vicious guerrilla conflict that enveloped the communities along the Missouri-Kansas state line and the vast army of displaced and dispossessed people that resulted from it were the unfortunate outcome of the long fight over the future of the region in the 1850s. So the animosities that were engendered by years of strife along the border quickly spilled over into the developing political crisis that emerged in Missouri in the months after Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860. The state was politically and militarily contested during the first year of the war. And although many people hailed from upper South states and slavery remained important both socially and economically, initially most Missourians reasoned that they could best preserve their way of life, including slavery, if the state remained in the Union. Missourians were quickly forced to choose sides when Missouri's secessionist governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, assembled a pro-Southern state militia, which Union troops opposed in the summer and fall of 1861. And although Confederate forces made some early military gains, and really these were pro-Southern forces in most cases, by the beginning of 1862, Union forces had pushed both the Confederate Army and Jackson's secessionist government into northwestern Arkansas. And with the exception of a few dramatic raids into the state by Confederate forces, Missouri was under Union military occupation for the remainder of the war. Union troops were strategically scattered in towns throughout Missouri in an effort to control the countryside and protect the railroad lines and the rivers. And a secessionist guerrilla insurgency arose to counter the growing Union military occupation. Now in Kentucky, of course, the state was hotly contested in the early years of the war by opposing regular Army forces. Kentucky, like Missouri, tried to remain neutral initially, but the state's strategic location and the river systems were so vital to both Union and Confederate military efforts that the two armies fought in various parts of the state in the first year of the war. And as was the case in Missouri, Kentucky men enlisted in both armies, and secessionists broke away to form a rival Confederate state government. Kentucky continued to be contested into the second year of the war, but like Missouri, was mostly in the hands of Union forces by the second half of the war, with the exception of periodic raids from Confederate forces, such as those commanded by Morgan, as well as guerrilla insurgents. Although the citizens of both states suffered from a guerrilla conflict, the violence was particularly intense in Missouri. The fight was worst along Missouri's western border, where hostilities smoldered from the earlier fight over Kansas. Not only were the people of western Missouri deeply divided over secession, but they also had to contend with revenge-minded Kansas troops like Jennison's Jayhawkers. The conflict invariably drew in the civilian population in both states. In the end, tens and thousands of Kentucky and Missouri men joined the Confederate and Union armies, local militias and home guard units, and guerrilla forces. Countless women, children, and the elderly were forced to care for their households without the assistance of male relatives. In addition to the ongoing violence, civilians also faced the threat of economic dislocation. Both Union troops and guerrilla forces lived off the fat of the countryside, borrowing from those who supported them and stealing from those who did not. In addition, civilians also were vulnerable to persecution from neighbors with whom they differed. The resulting chaos adversely affected civilians and ultimately created a large-scale refugee population that was comprised both of white Unionists and secessionists, as well as formerly enslaved people. Although it is impossible to accurately calculate how many border state civilians were displaced by the war, it is apparent that the crisis created significant dislocation. In Missouri, the river counties and the counties along the state's western border were areas of strong secessionist support, while in Kentucky, the areas with the strongest support for secession were in the western, central bluegrass, and southern parts of the state. Still, there were people with mixed allegiances scattered throughout both states. During the early years of the war, armed combatants frequently made raids against their enemies and systematically worked to purge their neighborhoods of those with whom they disagreed politically. For example, hundreds of Unionist families were pushed out of western Missouri in the early months of the war. Many sought refuge just across the border, the western border, into Kansas, which had by then entered the Union as a free state in January 1861. but a lot of others headed eastward to St. Louis. The emerging military conflict also displaced Kentucky and Missouri, a lot of Kentucky and Missouri civilians. The rapidly shifting fortunes of Union and Confederate forces in 1861 and early 1862 forced civilians of both political persuasions out of communities held by enemy forces. For example, Unionist civilians, including over 500 enslaved people, left Springfield, Missouri, with the Union Army on a slow march back to Kansas after their defeat to Confederate forces at Wilson's Creek in August 1861. Civilian displacement caused by troop movements proved to be much more significant in Kentucky due to the fight over Kentucky and Tennessee in the early years of the war. Many locations, such as the strategically important Bowling Green, changed hands during the war, at one point forcing out Unionist Josie Underwood and her family, and then later pro-Confederate Mary Van Meter and her family. Once the U.S. Army secured the states for the Union, it was charged with maintaining control. But in many places, the Union hold was fragile and did not expand much beyond a small radius around Missouri's military garrison towns. And these are actually Missouri Confederates. The ones that you probably know are the two in the far bottom right-hand corner. That's Frank and Jesse James. The surrounding countryside often belonged to the secessionist guerrillas. Union Army officers quickly determined that containing the guerrillas would be challenging. Guerrillas typically attacked small detachments of soldiers as they paroled and then disappeared into the brush to regroup for their next attack. It also quickly became apparent that local secessionists were providing guerrillas with food, clothing, horses, fodder, and shelter. The Union Army often used harsh measures to subdue the large disloyal population. The citizens of both states were placed under martial law, and a military provost marshal system was established to regulate and prosecute disloyal civilians. Citizens were asked to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States if they wished to benefit from the protection of Union troops, keep their guns, practice their professions, and escape the financial assessments that were levied against disloyal citizens. So many men and women signed the oaths, including soldiers, although soldiers and Unionists suspected that some of these people lied to keep from being assessed or harassed. While this was true in some cases, that they did falsely sign the oaths, it appears that soldiers were predisposed to believe that those of Southern origin, especially enslavers, were disloyal. Those charged with disloyalty were frequently imprisoned in local army encampments, and others were transferred to Union military prisons in St. Louis and Louisville or in nearby free states. Others were banished from the states. And it was not unheard of for soldiers to shoot or hang suspected secessionists without the benefit of a trial. Union soldiers hailing from Kansas, whom Missourians derisively called Jayhawkers or Redlegs, gained a reputation for the worst brutality in Missouri. And I'm going the wrong direction. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. While not all were involved in jayhawking activities, many of the men who filled the ranks of the Union Army in Kansas held deep-seated resentments toward Missourians, and they took any opportunity to settle old scores from bleeding Kansas days. Jayhawkers frequently made raids across the border into Missouri, violently harassing and sometimes murdering Missouri men, confiscating property, including horses, livestock, and personal household items, and liberating Missouri's enslaved people. Confederate bushwhackers often pointed to federal soldiers' abuse of civilians and the theft and destruction of their property as their reason for joining the guerrillas. These men generally were recruited from the local population, and gangs often operated in the vicinity of their own neighborhoods. So familiarity with their surroundings ended up being an asset, allowing them to hit their targets and quickly melt back into the countryside. Operating locally also allowed them to remain near their supply networks, which were largely made up of their own relatives and neighbors. By midway through the war, women and the elderly headed many of these guerrilla households. Although they promoted their cause as noble, in the end, guerrillas' tactics were every bit as brutal as those of the Jayhawkers and, in some cases, Union troops. They often claimed that their attacks were primarily retaliatory, but this simply was not always the case. The occupying Union troops were the primary focus of the guerrillas, but they also targeted local Unionists, especially the much despised German American population, and worked diligently to intimidate enslaved people to remain with their owners. The guerrillas could be ruthless. They frequently forced Unionists out of their homes by systematically stripping them of their property, as well as through intimidation and violence. It was not unusual for them to drag enemy men from their beds, shoot or hang them within sights of their families, and then burn their homes. Fearing an attack, some Unionists fled, while others sought the protection of federal troops. The ongoing violent conflict between Union and guerrilla forces decimated the farms and towns in many parts of the border states, and by midway through the war, some locations were nearly stripped bare of signs of their pre-war prosperity. Burned buildings scattered the landscape. The area was nearly devoid of fence rails. Horses, mules, and livestock were in short supply, and in some places, fields lay barren. Lizzie Brannock described the devastated landscape in western Missouri. She said, quote, "Our country is desolate, indeed, almost entirely a wilderness. Robbery is an everyday affair so long as there is anything to take. Our farms are all burned up, fences gone, crops destroyed. No one escapes the ravages of one party or the other." And Mary Van Meter described a similar scene in Bowling Green when she returned from her time as a refugee. The border states were hit especially hard by this foraging activity. Over time, even those who willingly supplied men fighting for their chosen side felt beleaguered by the incessant demands placed on them when they increasingly had so little to give. In many parts of the border states, men's lives were dominated by concerns about the theft and destruction of their property, as well as the well-being of male family members. Men and boys routinely hid in the woods with their livestock in an attempt to preserve both their property and their lives. Many even were afraid to plow and plant their fields, fearing that working in the open would expose them. It became increasingly difficult for families to continue to farm under such circumstances. And believing that women would not be physically harmed, many left their wives and children at home to protect their property the best that they could. Some men eventually concluded that the risks were just too great, and they decided to leave their homes. Many fled under the cover of night to thwart enemy combatants who might be on the lookout for them. Some took to the woods as guerrilla fighters, while others fled to the safety of nearby towns or cities. There was a strong Union military presence in St. Louis, for example, and Unionists gravitated there in large numbers from the earliest days of the war. But many secessionists also found a safe haven in the city. Men of both political persuasions also made their way to the states of the Old Northwest, often seeking refuge with kin. Arkansas, Texas, and Kentucky were much more popular destinations for Missouri secessionists, however. Now, in Kentucky, many secessionist refugees headed southward, while Unionists headed northward to Louisville and crossed the Ohio River into the states of the Old Northwest. Some families traveled together to their destination. Mary Van Meter fled from Bowling Green south through Tennessee with the members of her household and others from her community after the city fell to Union troops in early 1862. The family settled for much of the remainder of the year in a hospitable community in northern Alabama. Missourians, and I suspect a few Kentuckians, of both political persuasions also looked westward as they sought a safe haven during the war. Many imagined the West as a place of refuge, while others were likely intrigued by the promise of Western land offered by the 1862 Homestead Act. Of course, you had to be loyal to get that land, and continuing prospects for mining. Many men took off across the plains to escape wartime violence and evade the Union military draft. Women also made the overland trek during the war years. While some returned home after the situation cooled off, many people remained permanently in the West. Some men believed that they could ride out the conflict and quickly reunite with their families who remained at home. But as the war dragged on and conditions often became more unbearable, many women decided to leave as well. Few people lightly made the decision to abandon their homes and property. but many felt that they were left with no other option. The decision to leave often came at great economic loss. Few people could expect to sell farms located in such a hostile environment and most simply abandon their property. And even as they left, of course, most hoped that one day they would be able to return to their homes. Now, in contrast, enslaved people reasoned that leaving their homes would, of course, change their circumstances for the better. Starting in the summer of 1861, they recognized the opportunities created by the wartime turbulence and the presence of Union troops and began to flee from their owners in large numbers. Missouri and Kentucky enslavers frequently accused Union soldiers of, quote, stealing their slaves, but enslaved people most often gladly made the decision to accompany soldiers. Although they were not always warmly welcomed, they imagined free states as safe havens, and many took advantage of their close proximity and made their way there. A Kansas City newspaper reported that free people, quote, are constantly streaming through our streets, end quote, on their way to Kansas, for example. Others ran toward the Union troops stationed in the garrison towns that dotted the Missouri and Kentucky countrysides. And during the first years of the war, Union Army officers typically returned enslaved people of Unionist enslavers, and there was a lot of confusion about this, but that was what was mandated by official policy in the border states. But toward the end of the war, few enslavers, regardless of their loyalties, were able to reclaim them. Not all enslaved people were refugees by choice, however. Many enslavers decided that the best means of protecting enslaved people, which they considered to be their property, was to, quote, refugee them, and that was the word that they used, far behind Confederate lines, where they often sold them or left them in the care of family or friends. Texas was a favored destination of Missouri slaveholders, while some Kentuckians headed south toward Alabama and Mississippi. Richard Kimmons's master so feared that Union soldiers would take his enslaved people that he sent them to his son in Texas, literally leaving his crops standing in the fields. When Mary Van Meter and her family headed to Alabama, they took their enslaved people with them. Tragically, Missourians were also known to send enslaved people by railroad and steamboat to Kentucky, interestingly, for sale. I have seen quite a lot of evidence in Union military records that this activity persisted throughout the war. And some officers were making what were really ethical arguments about the fact that they needed to protect these people. But from what I can see, in many cases, that others are seemingly more concerned that this practice of enslavers shipping people out of state for sale would ultimately undermine the Union Army's efforts to recruit Black soldiers in Missouri. Once white people made the decision to leave, a fortunate few had the benefit of ample time to organize and pack for their trips, but threats of violence or eviction forced many to leave in great haste with only a few of their possessions. The most important decision, of course, was which direction to head. Some chose to journey toward family or friends, while others headed toward places where they believed they might receive aid. The trip was often perilous as refugees navigated the border states' war-torn landscapes. As the region became increasingly dangerous for men, women and children often made the trip alone. Mrs. Silliman claimed that many Western Missouri women moved, quote, to other states, to their relatives, some on foot carrying their little children, the others following with their bundles in their hands, women driving an ox team with what little furniture they dared to stop long enough to tumble in, to flee for their lives from the bushwhackers, she said. So she's making it clear her allegiances. Most traveled overland to their destination, although a lucky few were able to secure passage on steamboats and trains. The journey was particularly difficult for disloyal citizens, for secessionists who had to negotiate the Union military pass system in order to travel through areas of occupation. So Mary Van Meter, again, in her diary, reveals the confusion that was felt by displaced people as they tried to gather information about troop movements while en route. So they were just constantly hearing all these rumors about where the Union troops were. And in addition, she describes, the long train of wagons and buggies of those, quote, exiled from their homes. In the absence of male escorts, some women formed travel partnerships, such as when Parthenie Horn and a group of women formed a wagon train to travel from southwestern Missouri to Texas. And although it was much safer to travel in numbers, companionship did not always result in a trouble-free journey. It often was difficult to secure help if there was a problem along the way. During the war year, people were genuinely, I think, suspicious of unknown travelers, and many were concerned that if they aided the wrong person, they would face retribution from their enemies. So when a wheel broke on one of the Cedar County women's wagons and they could not fix it themselves, they searched for a couple of days to find a man who was willing to help, quote, rebel women. By midway through the war, many people could ill afford to demonstrate the type of hospitality that had been common in pre-war days. But as Confederate refugees made their way into areas with more people who shared their loyalties, they often met with assistance from the strangers they encountered. Again, Mary repeatedly speaks on her trip south of the hospitality that was provided by sympathetic, sort of distant friends and relatives and strangers on the journey south. While travel was difficult for white people, it was even more harrowing for enslaved people as they made their way to freedom. Those who attempted to run away did so at great risk to their lives. As slavery began to disintegrate, enslavers became increasingly desperate to maintain labor discipline and keep enslaved people working on their farms. Not only did they vigilantly watch their enslaved people's movements, sometimes even locking them up at night to stop their flight. And I've seen cases where they took their clothes from them to make sure that they had no clothes to run away. But they also were aided in their efforts by local slave patrols and later secessionist guerrillas who filled this crucial role when when many local governments ceased to function effectively. Bushwhackers became particularly brutal after the Union Army began to recruit enslaved men midway through the war. One formerly enslaved Missourian observed, quote, "It was worth a Negro's life almost to try to get away." Escaped enslaved people systematically made their way toward local military camps and across the state line into free states to gain protection. Most traveled at night, avoiding the roads. In the last half of the war, the Union Army's primary military objective in the border states was to contain the guerrilla insurgency. Both the military's official and unofficial policy toward the guerrillas and their supporters ultimately influenced soldiers' interactions with refugees as well. Unionists and contrabands, and I'm putting that in quotes, as the Army often unfortunately referred to freedom seekers, and this signified the fact that they were the property of enslavers, legally the property of enslavers, and thus the Army considered them contraband of war. So Unionists and contrabands expected some level of protection and assistance from federal troops because of their loyalty to the Union cause. Union officers frequently asked their commanders for resources to aid the growing refugee population. During the early years of the war, mostly men fled to camps to escape both slavery and the political violence in the countryside. But as the war wore on, it was more often women, children, and the elderly who sought refuge with the Army. Although some were sympathetic, soldiers had limited authority or means to assist refugees and frequently dealt with them harshly. For example, in November 1864, federal soldiers evicted freedom-seeking women and children from Camp Nelson in Kentucky, resulting in the death of over 100 people. This policy was ultimately reversed and aid provided to them, but the harm had been done. And in fact, in many locations, officers worked to get the Army and the aid organizations to expand their missions and provide assistance to needy citizens who were displaced by the war. Eventually, some distributed partial military rations and provided shelter to refugees, but in many places, the displaced population swelled so large that it overwhelmed those attempting to help. Lack of food and shelter became an ongoing problem in military camps in the last years of the war. Captain G.W. Murphy reported from Sedalia, Missouri, which is in central Missouri, in July 1863 that the women and children who had sought protection in his encampment were, quote, suffering for something to eat. Some officers believed a logical way to alleviate the problem was to impress refugees into service to the Union cause. They asked for permission up the chain of command to put people to work within army camps and to recruit men into military service. White Unionists regularly enrolled, and eventually enslaved refugees were recruited into the U.S. Army. In the end, African American recruitment exacerbated the refugee problem in military camps because enslaved women rightly believed that if their husbands and fathers enlisted, the Army was obligated to assist them as they made their transition to freedom. It was reported that many arrived at the camps, quote, with nothing to eat or scarcely wear. There was not enough to support for Black refugees in the so-called contraband camps adjacent to these military encampments. Now, there were some coordinated private charity efforts to aid the many refugees who flooded into St. Louis, Louisville, or nearby free states during the war. But in most instances, the task fell to the uncoordinated efforts of individual soldiers and local civilians. The Western Sanitary Commission and refugee-focused aid organizations ultimately helped displaced people in St. Louis. And in 1864, Unionists established the Louisville Refugee Commission to meet refugees' needs there. A group of ministers and businessmen led by Reverend John H. Haywood, the Harvard-educated minister of the First Unitarian Church, founded the commission in response to the growing humanitarian crisis in their city. Haywood outlined the history and work of the organization in a fascinating report in January 1865 that was later published and distributed. He reported that refugees began coming to the city as early as the first days of the war. This is something that the people of St. Louis experienced as well. Haywood observed, quote, the number of refugees set adrift by the rebellion is so great, the movement having become almost like the migration of a tribe, he said. He described the displaced people and their needs in this way, and this is kind of with some prejudice, I should add. Quote, they came singly and in families. Some of them were intelligent and industrious. Some brought a little money, clothing, and furniture with them. But the great majority were of the undeveloped, shiftless, aimless class known as the poor whites of the South, and were utterly destitute of the means of support. The few who were energetic soon found work either in the city or the vicinity or passed on to the neighboring states. The others lingered around, he said, ready to sink into hopeless, squalid pauperism. Now, clearly, his statement reflects 19th century middle and upper class people's beliefs about poor people and their worthiness. The report does not mention concerns about the political loyalties of those they were helping, however. Now, this is in contrast to the Western Sanitary Commission, which was absolutely consumed with this issue in the first 2 years of the war. They feared that they would waste their precious resources on disloyal people. And the other part of it is that, like the U.S. Sanitary Commission, they were established to help the troops, Union troops. And so they were also concerned about shifting funds from that mission to this other mission that was not part of their mandate. Although eventually the Western Sanitary Commission came to the same conclusion as the citizens of Louisville, the humanitarian crisis, and that was that the humanitarian crisis was so severe and the burden on the Union military of caring for these, quote, homeless wanderers was so heavy that local citizens needed to step in to alleviate the suffering. The Louisville Commission worked with the Union Army headquartered in the city to identify multiple buildings to house and to aid displaced people. One of these was at the site of a hospital at the military prison. It's a little bit hard to see, but you see military prison, and I don't know why these stickers were put on this map at the Filson, but they were. They were numbered is why they were put on the map. So the military prison is number 2, and you can see underneath it says refugee home. So that at the military prison, there was a hospital there, and the Army gave it over, at least for a time, to the commission to use as a refugee house. The organization, which included an army of local women who did much of the hands-on aid work, actively worked to secure clothing and supplies for the refugees and raise funds on their behalf. In October 1864, the commission widely distributed what they called an appeal to the Christian people of our country, This was a broadside, which was issued under Haywood's name and starts with the statement, quote, "The white refugees from the South have accumulated in our vicinity to such an extent that our local charity is no longer adequate to their relief. They are still arriving in constantly increasing numbers, mostly women and children, and all of them equally destitute, homeless, and almost hopeless." And then the broadside goes on to say that thousands are living in tents and, quote, "huts made of branches throughout the local woods." But it goes on to say winter is coming and it will, quote, "bring upon them a distress terrible to contemplate unless speedy relief is afforded them." And it reports that, quote, "sickness and death have begun their ravages among them," and called on the, quote, "Christian people for aid in saving those displaced from, quote, want, exposure, and death." Haywood expresses particular concern for the children among them, hoping those in the nearby communities might provide placements, stating, quote, "Our only hope of raising the children of these refugees above the present ignorant and thriftless condition of their parents is in placing them where they will learn to look upon honest toil as ennobling and so be redeemed from ignorance and laziness," he says. So clearly, he doesn't fully understand why these people are displaced, and he layers all this stuff on them. The appeal in the broadside worked. Aid flooded in from throughout the North, but the people of New England were especially generous, sending both clothing and money. Northeastern aid organizations such as the American Union Commission and the New England Refugees Aid Society actively worked with the Louisville Commission to organize the response. Many displaced people remain in Louisville in the multiple refugee homes managed by the commission, where people could find housing, food, and clothing, and children could receive schooling and religious education. Also, they taught girls how to sew. But one of their primary strategies was to transport refugees to other communities, both in Kentucky, such as in Eminence and Newcastle, as well as north of the Ohio River in Indiana and Illinois, where local people provided support and employment opportunities. And they make a point about how there was a need for laborers, and so they were happy to receive these folks. The commission's end goal was for the displaced families to become self-supporting in their new homes. The commission observed that they had no accounting for the actual number of displaced people who made their way through their city, but they did know that they had provided support for thousands of people. In no place does the commission indicate the race of the people they supported, but it was typical at the time to call white displaced people refugees and Black displaced people contraband. So I think they were mostly helping white refugees. Now, for its part, the Western Sanitary Commission helped both white and Black people in the last years of the war. Most refugees eventually arrived at a destination from which they hoped to wait out the war. Some reported that they were satisfied with their situation in their chosen refuge, but many others found that their troubles followed them. Some relocated within the region and continued to be plagued by troop movements, as well as persecution and threats of violence from enemy forces. Mary Van Meter, again, eventually she returned to Bowling Green without her husband after Union troops made their way into northern Alabama. Many others felt physically safe, yet still complained that they felt unwelcome and uncomfortable in their new homes. And often the root of their dissatisfaction was political disagreements with the residents of their host communities. Now, the many challenges faced by both civilians and the military forces as they work to navigate the tense situation of military occupation of communities and the many people displaced by the war ultimately led to Missouri's Order Number 11 eviction. In both Kentucky and Missouri, secessionist women and children often elicited little sympathy from Unionists or federal soldiers. And despite 19th century gender conventions, few people were inclined to care for women and children simply due to their gender or age. In fact, while women's gender sometimes protected them from violence against their bodies, it did not protect them from violence against their property or free them from harassment for their political beliefs. The Union Army routinely recognized women's political activities and punished them for disloyalty, arresting them, evicting them, and banishing them for their service to the Confederate cause. Unionists and soldiers also likely understood that the guerrilla insurgency could not succeed without the material support from secessionist women. and some may have been reluctant to assist those who had served as agents of war. Now, all of these factors played a role in General Ewing's decision to depopulate the border region in the summer of 1863. Ewing had already set into motion a plan to evict the occupants of known guerrilla households before Quantrell's raid on Lawrence. So after taking command of the newly created district of the border, which was put in place because of the guerrilla violence, in June of 1863, he had systematically set about collecting the names of disloyal border residents, a list made up of households mainly headed by women and elderly men. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but this goes on for pages. And it's all women and older men, and then sometimes she'll see so-and-so's and husband in the brush, son in the brush. And, he's basically indicating, person who's making the list is indicating that they are guerrillas. They're members of guerrilla bands. On August 13th, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. Midsummer, he began to arrest family members of known guerrillas. So he was trying to force their hand, and those for whom there was proof that they had provided material aid to the guerrillas. On August 13th, the makeshift Kansas City prison in which some of the secessionist women were imprisoned mysteriously collapsed, killing 4 of the women and maiming many others, including the sister of Bloody Bill Anderson, who was a notorious guerrilla. What historians think happened is that the soldiers who were on the downstairs floor moved a load-bearing wall, and the building ended up accidentally collapsing. But at the time, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories about what had actually happened. Before the dust of the jail had barely settled, Ewing issued 2 military orders that allowed for the enlistment of enslavement of disloyal citizens, ordered the destruction of blacksmith shops, and called for the arrest of eviction of all border citizens who supported the guerrillas. So the blacksmith shops is because they can shoot the horses, the guerrillas' horses. 3 days later, Quantrell and his band of 400 guerrillas rode on Lawrence, Kansas, which they called an abolitionist hellhole, massacred as many as 180 unarmed men and boys, and torched the town. And this is one of the many versions of what that might have looked like. Ewing believed that the bushwhackers had forced his hand when they made this horrific raid. He had long reasoned that the guerrilla insurgency could not be contained if disloyal citizens remained to support it, but now he also feared that vengeful Kansans would sweep into western Missouri on a bloody retaliatory raid, and they were making noise that they were going to do that. Ewing thought the best chance to contain the violence was to virtually depopulate and destroy the Missouri border counties, leaving nothing left for anyone to fight over. And so this is a map. You can see it's south of the Missouri River are the counties. So there's kind of a natural border as you go north of what's now the city of Kansas City. He promptly ordered the eviction of all residents of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern portion of Vernon counties, because that was within his district, allowing only certified unionists, people who had signed an oath of loyalty and they believed were loyal, to relocate within the garrison towns scattered throughout the northern part of the military district. While some citizens were able to get out ahead of the invasion of the Kansas troops who were sent in to implement the order, others literally had minutes to vacate their dwellings before the soldiers ransacked and burned their homes. As depicted in Missouri artist George Caleb Bingham's painting, Martial Law, countless border residents were given a matter of minutes to drag a few precious possessions from their homes before they were burned. And we could do a lot of unpacking on this image. He was a unionist, but clearly he's showing the 2 enslaved men leaving, covering their eyes. It's a complicated image that he has painted here. He was furious about what happened, even though he was part of the Union government down in the Capitol in Jefferson City during this time. And I should mention the other reason he was furious is that it was his building that they had taken control of and turned into a building that he owned in downtown Kansas City. The one that collapsed was owned by Bingham. So he was really ticked off about that as well, because he felt like he was implicated in all of this. Union soldiers also burned outbuildings, confiscated livestock, grain, and hay, and commandeered modes of transport, which were, of course, essential to the conveyance of the now refugee population. Some border residents resisted eviction, men, and their shows of defiance often had violent consequences. Now, the human misery, so evident in the long train of refugees portrayed in the background of Bingham's painting, was the reality of life on Western Missouri's roads in the wake of the eviction order. In the extreme heat of late summer, women, children, and the elderly, the overwhelming demographic of the remaining civilian residents of the border region, clogged the dusty roads, leading to the south and east with the rattletrap wagons and carts that transported their meager belongings. Confederate sympathizers sought refuge where they could find it, in counties directly east of the border region, in mid-Missouri, where many had roots, with distant relatives in Kentucky or Tennessee, and Texas, where thousands of Missourians had fled with enslaved people during the early years of the war, and in northern states such as Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, and even on the Great Plains and as far west as California. Not all refugees were heartily welcomed in their new homes, where residents often faced their own wartime burdens and many resented or feared aiding suspected secessionists. Now, although the order was quickly rescinded due to political embarrassment and loyal border residents were welcomed back to their homes, little remained for the few who decided to return. In fact, between the fires set by Union soldiers and the wildfires that were common on the high-grass prairies in late summer, vast stretches of western Missouri were turned into a charred wasteland, with only chimneys remaining to mark the spots where homes once stood. Later that fall, Major J.T. Ross of the 11th Kansas Cavalry described the appearance of what quickly became known as the Burnt District. Quote, "The depopulation of the counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and Vernon is complete. The travel may ride for hours without seeing a single inhabitant. Deserted houses and farms are everywhere to be seen, and the whole is one great picture of desolation." After General Order Number 11, the permanent population of the border counties shrunk to a few thousand Unionists who huddled during the brutal winter of 1864 in towns in the northern part of the district, where they could expect Union military protection. Although moving the secessionist women and children out of the border disrupted the guerrilla supply chain and achieved Ewing's objective of moving the bushwhackers out of the border region, in the end, it merely pushed the problem into central Missouri. So the bushwhackers went to Texas for the winter and they came back to central Missouri. General Order Number 11 resulted in the eviction of civilians on a scale that up to that point was unprecedented during the Civil War. The fact that it was issued, however, should not be surprising given the long and violent fight in the region during the years leading up to August 1863. Nearly a decade of bad blood and violence in Missouri had left the region devastated, and the cataclysmic events of August 1863 were merely the culmination of years of displacement and destruction in Missouri and also in Kentucky. What is most important to recognize, however, is that this tragic event, while epic in scope, represents but a fraction of American civilians displaced during the war. The scope of the crisis eventually became so dire in the South that the federal government was forced to respond. And in 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. But long before this step was taken, the people of Kentucky and Missouri and the soldiers who were stationed there had found their own solutions, however imperfect, to the refugee crisis that developed in the border region. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. That gives us a lot to think about here. So I'll go ahead. We do have a few minutes, so if anybody has any questions, you can just go ahead and post those in the Q&A. And I have a few questions of my own. Is there any way, given how far you've gotten in your research up to this point, and they talk about this as a crisis, there's a lot of people that are being shuffled around and moved around. Is there any way that can be quantified in any kind of specific manner? I know how these numbers work. It's just kind of like a guessing game.
I don't know. So, the commission in Louisville tries to do that. They have a chart in that that document, in that report, where they've sort of listed out the months and how many people they've helped and all that, but then, they sort of throw up their hands and say, well, we don't we don't really know. I don't know. I mean, my intention, and this again may be like, this may be overly ambitious, but I would like to try to, as I work to process all of these collections, create some spreadsheets to try to map where people are going and what they're doing, to at least try to determine some patterns in where they're going. It's been estimated in those border counties that I talked about that were the focus of order number 11. It's been estimated that, well, there were 40,000 people there in 1860 in those counties. And, a couple of people have estimated that maybe half of them were already gone before the order was even, given. So it evicted half of the population, maybe 20,000 people. But even that, I don't think we can really know. Just like we don't really know the number of civilian deaths during the Civil War. I mean, people have tried to do some demographic modeling, computer modeling, and estimated up the number of soldiers who were killed during the war, because, the way that they created that count was very labor intensive. Humans were doing it, mistakes could be made. But, so maybe 750,000 instead of 620,000. But civilians, we don't know how many people. I mean, I guess there could be some demographic modeling to try to figure that out as well. But my sense is there were tens and thousands of people. I'm sure even more than, I mean, many more than that were displaced, and who knows how many people died from deprivation, from violence, from all of these different things during the war. I mean, it's really, honestly, something that, I think we've just scratched the surface on.
Yeah. And your mentioning of this, the classism that existed, especially when you're talking about these upper class folks who are working, to sort of look after these refugees that were coming from areas, say from, Tennessee, East Tennessee, things like that, into Kentucky. That's something else to think about. And
Yeah.
when you're talking about issues of war and conflict, I mean, that it's very evident today in modern times, and these unintended consequences of conflicts in the Middle East and refugees being expelled all over the place, and this idea of how does that change the political landscape, during and after the war, in the United States. How do the appearance of these refugees help to or facilitate, this image of the South and the Northern mind?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right, especially as people are, sort of gathering along the border, they're spilling over into free states. I think all that you say is true. And you see similar things with the Western Sanitary Commission. I'm just, I have so much more work to do with U.S. Sanitary Commission, but there are these different organizations that basically I've discovered are, I mean, every place that the Louisville Commission was sending people, they formed their own refugee commissions in those communities. So I think in the border states, there were commissions, other places, people are trying to help. But I mean, it's very clear from that report that part of the reason why they're helping is they want workers. And so how are they treating them, once they arrive in their communities? Do they stay? I mean, these are all really important questions. And, somebody like Mary Van Meter is probably getting a better reception at the homes that they try to get help from because of her appearance. And she's riding in a buggy, and, she is part of the slaveholding class and all of these different things. People with means had places to go oftentimes, and people who could help them, and people like, the family that probably is coming out of in this image, which was published in, I can't remember if it's Harper's or Frank Leslie's illustrated. But these are folks coming out of the Ozarks who would be much like the people you're talking about coming out of Eastern Kentucky and Tennessee. And, they don't have shoes. They look a little rough around the edges, and they were spilling into St. Louis. And then eventually they were coming on the riverboats. The Army was transporting people. I found an order from Sherman actually kind of late in the war saying that, the Army's going to transport people. We're going to transport them out of our way, basically. And we're shipping them up north for somebody else to deal with them. And we'll pay to transport them, but then you deal with them once they get there. And if they're within your city limits, you're responsible for burying them. We're not. And, and in some of the reports the Western Sanitary Commission published, I mean, they were just desperately just heartbreaking stories. There's this one story that I just, can't get out of my mind where they tell about a mother and her children disembark on the levee in St. Louis, and the mother is desperately sick, and the child, who, is probably late grade school age or whatever, goes to try to find help for his mother, and when he comes back, she's dead. And, she had just died. She expired on and in the military cemetery there in St. Louis, on, one of the Civil War era military bases. I was just kind of driving around the military cemetery, because I thought it was kind of, they're obviously peaceful and interesting places to look around. And I found this whole series of tombstones for refugees, many of them unmarked graves, no names, but it indicated that they were refugees, which tells you how many people died there at that military camp. And I'm sure the same is true in a place like Louisville. I mean, well, they talk about it. I mean, 50 people died, during this one period, that they reported on, the commission reported on.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And this is the last question I'll ask, because we are running a little bit over time. But when you're talking about that kind of trauma, I mean, nowadays they talk about this issue of ongoing trauma or generational trauma, and I wonder if it's possible to track some of these people who wound up being refugees and experience that kind of trauma, death or violence, because displacement because of the war, and how it affected them, years or decades later, especially when it comes to how they remembered the war. When we talk about the 1880s and the 1890s, in Kentucky and the South, and the onset of lost cause memory, of the solidification
Right.
memory of the Union cause later on, like how that all plays in with them going forward.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, it's as it's been argued both in Kentucky and Missouri that the experience of the war is what caused people to turn to Confederate memory, 50 years out from the war. So it would be surprising if it didn't. The problem, of course, with any of this is that, we oftentimes have the words of wealthier people and we don't have the words of poor people. And so I'm finding out about their stories through indirect ways. And that's true, of course, of freedom seekers, of enslaved people who escaped as well. So it's challenging. It's challenging to find the stories of people, but ultimately these are the people I'm most interested in. I'm not as interested in the wealthy people who, were able to get out ahead of armies and found a safe haven someplace. I'm more interested in these poor people who are flooding into these cities, just desperately seeking help. Hopefully, I'll score some, I'll strike some gold along the way, and find some of these stories, but it's really, hard. They get channeled through, like, in that report that I was talking about from Louisville, they tell how they end the whole report is with the story of these orphan children, that two of them had been sent to Kentucky, and they were two older children, really concerned because they had lost their two younger siblings somehow. Their parents had died and they were separated from them, and ultimately one of the siblings is sent to Louisville, and they didn't know he was coming, and they reunite with him. So it's just like lovely, they're lovely scenario scene where they were reunited and they're, trying to obviously pull on people's heartstrings to get them to give more money and to support, they talk about orphans. I mean, children were orphaned during the war. And I do want, before we get off, this was kind of a super cool find. I haven't yet sat down at a piano and tried to pick out the tune, but they have an amazing sheet music collection there at the Filson. And because there was a huge music publisher in town, and there were multiple versions of these refugee songs that clearly were being reprinted in, over time during the war and after. So, that tells you that it's at least an experience that enough people find interesting, certainly. But,
Yeah, these are fascinating.
yeah, they're super fascinating. So, yeah, and she looks like a little peasant girl or something, with her bare feet and her shawl over her head. And this was actually one that had somehow landed, the Getty image one had actually landed in a collection in, I think at Johns Hopkins at their library, but these other two were from the Filson. So yeah, so that was a super cool find as I was doing my research. But again, I do need to sit down because I did take picture of the interior of the sheet music as well to see what in the heck this tune sounded like.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up here. Let's see. Who is we do have one question. Who is the individual picture in the upper right? In the upper right hand corner depicting gorillas. That was Bloody Bill Anderson.
Yeah, so these are the Missouri guerrillas. Well, this is Bloody Bill Anderson, the right, upper right, and then William Contrell, who looks very baby faced, on upper left, and Cole Younger is in lower left, and then the James brothers. That's who those guys are.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up now. So this concludes tonight's Kentucky Military History Museum speaker event, and I would like to thank our presenter, Dr. Diane Mutti Burke, for her time, for illuminating this complicated period in military history. And I'd also like to thank our audience for their continuing interest in this speaker series. And with that, hopefully we will all see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Diane.
Bye-bye.